What is it like to be a writer? Jim Crace and Samantha Shannon talk about the writing life in a discussion moderated by David Godwin. Jim Crace has written 11 novels. His works have been twice shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and have won 2 Whitbread Awards. Among his other honors are the National Books Critics Circle Award, the Guardian Fiction Prize, and the E.M. Forster Award. His novels have been translated into 28 languages. His latest book published is Harvest by Picador. Samantha Shannon started writing at the age of 15. Last summer, she graduated from St. Anne's College, Oxford, with a degree in English language and literature. In 2012, she was shortlisted for a Women of the Future Award. Her first novel, The Bone Season, was a New York Times bestseller upon publication last year. A publisher for many years, David Godwin decided in 1995 that he didn't fit in the new corporate field of publishing and became a literary agent instead. David Godwin Associates is now one of London's leading agencies with a diverse and impressive set of writers, from Booker Prize winners Arvind Adiga, Arundhati Roy, to well-known biographers Richard Holmes and Claire Tomalin, and poets such as Simon Armitage and Michael Simmons Roberts. David's own book, Breaking 80, a short memoir about his life and golf, was published in 2011.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for staying for the last session. We'll do our best to keep you as enthralled as possible. The topic today, and we're going to talk for about 20 minutes, then we'll have some questions. Do make them questions as opposed to statements with, do you agree with me at the end? Okay? Now, the subject today is the writing life. So I'm going to start off in an entirely practical way and ask first Samantha to tell us about what her daily routine is as a writer.
I think when you describe the life of a writer on a daily routine kind of basis, it doesn't sound very exciting. I mean, I get up sort of about 8 in the morning, I have a cup of coffee, I check my emails and do my social media type stuff, and then I just write. And I try to write for about 8 hours a day, because I try to treat it like a job. So I try and have a routine. I think it's quite difficult because as a writer you are self-employed, so you don't have a boss telling you to get up and go, so you have to have your own discipline to do it. But yeah, I wish it sounded more exciting than that, but I have a lunch break, which isn't that exciting, but...
Yeah, hi. I'm a bit embarrassed by this question, I have to say, because David here is my agent. He's Samantha's agent as well. And I've been writing fiction now since 1986. And during that time, when David has asked me about my writing life, I've always told him lies. Because when he phones up and says, how's the book going, you can't say the truth, which is that he's just disturbed you in the deck chair in the garden. Or that you've been taking it easy for a fortnight and have made no progress. You always pretend to your agent and to your editor, and of course to yourself, that you're making progress with a novel when you're not. The truth of the matter is that in my case, the writing life is full of prevarications, reasons not to get on with it, most of which seem to be solitaire on the computer screen. But that's not the only one. I've got hundreds of devices and ways of not getting on with work. So prevarication is kind of my main skill. And it makes me feel ashamed of myself. It makes me feel ashamed of myself that I'm not doing a proper job with proper hours. However, I think when I've finished a novel, it feels to me that those days of prevarication that have made me so ashamed of myself and made me feel so lonely are somehow really essential parts of the process of writing. Without those days of prevarication, I would have made mistakes. I would have rushed into things. And I suppose it's because writing itself is such a very, very odd, unsexy, undramatic activity. There you are, alone in a room with no colleagues. In my case, up until just recently, I've been working in a converted garage next to our house in Birmingham. No colleagues, no one really interested in what you're doing, and living a life which is in no way adventurous or vivid. Real life is more vivid than your working life, and yet the odd thing is, the words on the screen, the story you're telling, are much more vivid than real life, because that's the nature of literature. So you're in a kind of a dull bubble between two vivid forms of existence. And that's a very strange thing to be in, strange place to be. So for me, with the writing life, is to pretend to have a schedule, to pretend to have a discipline, but actually to be quite lazy and prevaricating.
I want to switch it now, and I want, because you're two writers at very different positions in your career, and I want to ask you really whether you, I can start with Jim first, do you think you've had a career as a writer?
Well, I'm always very self-conscious about pretending that this is a job, because when you meet real people that have to get up early in the morning and take a bus somewhere and work hard all day, fixed hours, and have someone shouting at them and telling them what to do, it seems rather narcissistic to claim that you are also suffering and that you're a word version of a miner or a worker in a car factory. So when you ask writers whether you've got a career, I suppose what that really means is, do you have a life beyond the first book? Have you managed to spend your time writing and doing nothing else? And in that regard, I've been very, very lucky. I've never had a day job. I've never had to work for a boss. I've earned my living through writing and as a journalist and as a novelist all of my life. So yes, I've had a career, and I count myself as immensely lucky that that is the case. How about you,
Samantha, do you want a career?
I would like a career very much. I think I have the same thing with Jim, actually, is that you feel this odd sense of guilt when you're a writer, saying that you have a career in it, because again, it's a self-employed thing. You get up in the morning when you like. I mean, you tell yourself to get up at 8, but you don't absolutely have to. And I think it's probably the same with all artists, because what we do is entirely subjective. I could read a book and think it's rubbish, and you could think it's fantastic, or vice versa. And there will be people out there that don't like my writing and think that, I shouldn't be a writer. And I think you do some days you wake up feeling like a little bit of a fraud almost, because you think you're going to be exposed as someone who can't write and someone who doesn't deserve the job. And I mean, I certainly feel very, very fortunate that at the moment writing is my full-time job. I came straight out of university and my book was published, and I feel so grateful for that, because it is very difficult to get published nowadays. You have to find an agent, and you have to actually get a publisher. It has to do well before you can have it as a job. So it's I feel incredibly lucky to have it, and that's why I feel so guilty if I spend a day procrastinating. So I feel like I should be doing it properly somehow.
And do you not procrastinate?
I do procrastinate. My main vice is Twitter, actually, which I guess you could argue that it's not procrastination, because you are writing in short bursts, but you're not writing what you're meant to be writing. So
and you're not spelling it properly either.
I spell very well on my Twitter, thank you. But I have the same problem though. You end up just doing literally anything apart from write, and your brain is telling you need to write this chapter, you need to write another 1,000 words, or however you measure out how much writing you do, and suddenly you desperately want to play solitaire or something, which is something you probably never wanted to do before that day.
In specifics, do you work on the computer, or do you ever use pen and pencil? Are you old-fashioned or modernist?
I would love to use a typewriter. I might just go and buy one. But I remember my grandmother had an old typewriter, and I always used to sit there and just write on it, and it just felt amazing just seeing. And even when you make a mistake and you had to go back and use the funny little pencil that she had, the white pencil. But I think it feels much more like work when you're using a typewriter, because it feels very kind of manual. Whereas I do always use computer unless I don't have access to one. So then I'll take a notebook out, and occasionally I'll write a whole scene in a notebook. And I feel like I remember I went to Paris and I sat in a cafe and I wrote in a notebook, and I felt like a real writer at that point. But what about you, Hughes?
Oh, well, I make notes in really scruffy, scrawny handwriting, but I never actually write any finished version, except on the word processor. And I remember in 1986, when I was a journalist, a friend of mine, and in those days, you'd write a journalistic article, and you'd write it out, and you had to send off what was called fine copy. So if you decided that it was 100 words too long, or there was a bad sentence in it, or one word was wrong, you had to type the whole thing out again. And it seemed to me that 2/3 of my writing time was spent retyping. A friend of mine said, get a computer. And in those days, they were very, very clunky. I got a BBC computer for £1,000 in 1986. It virtually bankrupted me. But it saved me 3 days a week. 3 more days to play solitaire, if it had then been invented.
Well, there was that famous story of T. Lawrence writing 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Yeah. I mean, it was a huge book, taking it to his publisher and leaving the manuscript in a taxi. Yeah. The manuscript was gone. There was no copies, there was nothing. So, a longer version of your story was he had to settle down and write the whole book again from end to end, which is... And interestingly enough, it might have made it a better book, of course. I want to ask you, do you put writer in your passport as occupation?
I don't know. Does it say your occupation on your passport? I haven't looked at my passport.
David, you're way out of date.
I think you're out of date. I don't think mine has my career on it. So, sorry, I'm just embarrassing you now.
Funny story. Okay, it was a very funny story, which I'm sure you've heard, by Richard Holmes, about his passport. And he has on the passport, he goes to France and he delivers the passport to the desk. And during the course of his time in the hotel, he's incredibly well treated by all the staff. I mean, really unbelievably well in the restaurant. And he can't understand why. So at the end of his stay, he says to this guy, "Why have you treated me so well?" And the Frenchman said, "Well, we've seen your passport." And Richard says to him, "Well, so?" He says, "Yes, we saw you were a waiter under your occupation." And Richard then said, "Well, of course, I'm not a waiter, I am a writer." But that was why he has such a wonderful... You have no comparable experience, I don't imagine.
No, although I do get this terribly suspicious look when I say I'm a writer. Just in any situation, really. Kind of people look at you and like, what do you really do? Or what kind of writer are you really? Like, I mean, once I had, someone... asked, I think it was when I was going into a country, actually, and I was asked what I did, and I said, I'm a writer, and they kind of said, oh, you're a journalist. And I was like, no, I'm a writer of books. And they were like, what kind of books? It's all very suspicious, what are you really doing here? It's all weird to know.
You didn't say I'm a proper writer.
Well, no, I didn't say I was a proper, I just said I wrote books, and I showed them a copy of the book. That's kind of my defense. I hold out my book like a shield.
Well, it's been years since... I'm always embarrassed about calling myself a writer or an author. It seems a sort of bit declamatory, and so I never do it, really. If you do say people say, "Oh, should I have heard of you?" Or they mistake you for somebody else, or they want you to describe what's the plot of your latest book. Or a particular question I like is, what's the first line? And I can never remember any of those answers.
You don't just make it up.
No, I think there's a serious point behind this. We're all English on the stage here. And I'm sure that the audience is very aware that in England we're very self-conscious about seeming serious. It's considered in England bad manners to be serious for more than 2 sentences. So up until some years ago, I used to meet with fellow writers in Birmingham, including people like David Lodge and David Edgar. And I noticed amongst those intellectual writers that if anyone was serious for more than 2 sentences, someone would feel that a faux pas had been committed, and they'd immediately interrupt with an anecdote or a joke to relieve the tension. Because in England, the word intellectual is a term of abuse, not a term of approval. Where, of course, in Europe, the absolute opposite is true. And elsewhere in the world, in China, for example, if you call someone an intellectual, it's a note of approval. And if you were to interrupt someone being serious with an anecdote or a joke, that would be thought to be a faux pas. So this anti-intellectualism in England makes us rather annoyingly, but also quite sweetly, self-conscious about declaring our wares, about claiming that we're writers, about claiming that we're clever. We tend to obfuscate, and we tend to be careful with our information. We're desperate that you know we're writers, but we only hint it by sort of shuffling our books out from behind our pockets rather than declare it. So that's one of the things about English writing scene which I kind of love, our self-consciousness. But I also despise it as well because it's a bit
But do you think
dishonest.
you're in a club? I mean, do you feel, when you're with other writers, you gravitate to them, that you all know your kind of fellow workers, so to speak?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, when I'm with other writers, I tend to be quite embarrassed because my book only came out in August, so I feel like I'm very new to the whole thing, and people they do the thing, have I heard of you? And I'm like, probably not. I kind of do this. You kind of have to defend yourself almost. But I mean, I guess I will maybe change as I kind of grow into the role, and I've had 2 books out, which might make me feel more official.
I never mix with other writers. I hate other writers. They're all adulterers and drunks. Fortunately, I live in a city in England where there are very few writers, and I'm glad of that. No, it's again a serious point. I mean, the publishing industry and the writing industry in Britain is quite class-oriented, and I'm not going to say that I've got a chip on my shoulder, but I have a working-class background, which has made me self-conscious in that world. And even though I'm in my late 60s now, that self-consciousness has never disappeared. The English class system is so entrenched. The accent tells you everything, and background tells you everything. And I know that to admit this is kind of ludicrous, but I cling to that, those sets of beliefs at the same time that I'm also ashamed of them. So no, I'm not at ease in the company of other writers, and therefore I don't tend to hang out with any of them.
And you too? Well, it's early days, yes.
Yeah, it's early day. I mean, I wouldn't say I was necessarily ill at ease, but I think you definitely feel like, I don't know, I mean, I always feel terribly inadequate when I read other writers' work. I just immediately think, oh gosh, they're a much better writer than me. Like, why am I allowed to do this? I'm terrible. So I don't know, it's kind of an odd thing. I guess it's kind of a mix of admiration and terror sometimes, but that's probably, it could just be me.
But it's all kind of this sort of conspiracy, isn't it? That there are certain people, writers in the United Kingdom, who are not self-conscious about their skills because their voices are the kind of voice that's been approved of. I mean, it's interesting that where the English language is concerned in England, how class-oriented the notes of approval are for well-spoken English. You think of the 3 terms that we use so commonly in Britain to describe someone that is educated and well-spoken. We call it the Queen's English, we call it Oxford English, or we call it BBC English. And if you think about those 3 descriptions, those are the things that all parents aspire to for their children. Each of those descriptions are very, very class-oriented. You never hear a sort of a celebration of regional accents in the UK in the way that you would, for example, in America. And of course, these things are improving, and we're not in the 1930s. And there isn't the snobbery in the United Kingdom that there was. But nevertheless, the shadow of that snobbery is still there. And for people like myself that don't come from that kind of background, there's a sort of resentment which gives a little acid edge to my day.
But also, I also want to ask you, are you competitive? When you're up for prize, we were at the Booker earlier last year. I mean, what is really going on there for you?
Well, I remember when I was shortly for the Booker the time before, and they read out the name of Arundhati Roy. She won. Also your client, David. David owns everybody. And I remember feeling, when my name wasn't read out, a tremendous feeling of relief. Because the eye of the storm was not going to gather around me. I wasn't going to have to make a speech. Success wasn't going to reach into my life and crush me for the next fortnight. This time, when I was shortlisted and didn't win, I think I would have, either way I realized I was going to feel relief. Greater relief if I won, lesser relief if I didn't win. So I think that's what I feel. I expect and get relief every time.
Very good. I mean, Samantha, would you like to win a prize?
I mean, to be honest, I don't consider the fiction I write extremely literary. It's certainly nothing that would win, the Man Booker Prize or something like that. So I didn't go into it expecting to win any awards. So I've been listed sort of personally for awards. Like I recently won Red Magazine's Woman to Watch, and those bring their own kind of pressure, because suddenly I was like, well, am I worth watching? Like, do I need to say something desperately interesting now? And it's a lovely thing to receive, but you also kind of start thinking, do I really deserve this? And I think you do just feel a constant sense of guilt. Or that might just be me again, but it's just this endless guilt. Like, do I deserve this? Does my book deserve this? Do I deserve this? But I don't know, it would be nice to win an award, but I certainly don't, I wouldn't be disappointed if I never won one.
But being a writer now is very different to what it was when you started, Jim. There's the performance role, there's a social media role, and in a sense, the future for Samantha as a writer is going to be very different. Well, maybe it'll be very different for you looking back. It's changed a lot, I imagine.
Well, when I started writing fiction, I started as a journalist, so I was used to being published in one form. And in those days, there were hundreds of little publishing houses in the United Kingdom, all living in separate Victorian buildings and with loads of editors. And with a sense that what you would do is that you would pay for your literary losses with the successful sale of your popular books. And so that meant that if you went in a publishing house, your career was nurtured. If you were a good literary writer, it didn't matter that you were making a fortune for the publishing house. Someone else would make that profit for you, and they would look after you. But of course, as everybody knows, this has changed very much all the way around the world. Publishing houses have become one great conglomerate. The editors, unfortunately, have been replaced by accountants. Editorial decisions have to be passed through sales and marketing, so if you've written a genius of a novel that isn't going to appeal to many people, it won't get published. So sadly, things are very, very different for a young writer these days. I'm so glad I'm not that young writer these days, because the scene is complicated. And there's another complication as well, of course, and that is that the printed word is coming under such pressure. There's so many other forms of publication other than the ones controlled by publishing houses, in which you had to get the approval of an editor, you had to get the approval of an agent before your book could be in a bookshop. And of course, in many respects that was a bad thing, but it was a good thing because it protected standards. However, the one thing that I grab onto, two things I grab onto, which make me hopeful for every generation that follows mine. And I'm stuck in my ways, but young people coming along aren't stuck in their ways. First of all, remember what happened in America in a similar situation when they said we're going to do away with broadcast television and we're going to add satellite. Everyone said satellite cable, I beg your pardon, cable TV. At the time, people in America said cable TV is going to ruin television in America, because what it means is that anyone can make a program and that the lowest common denominator will work, in the same way that they're saying the same things about printing on the internet. And of course, we all know the very opposite happened. The freeing up of television in America enabled such great programs as The Wire and Breaking Bad and Mad Men to be made, all cable TV programs. And so the one revolution that we feared was actually the revolution which delivered high standards. So I feel that about publishing, maybe that's going to happen. And the second thing I feel about the publishing industry and young writers is that narrative is ancient. And even though publishing might come to an end, narrative and storytelling never will. And so for young writers, the future is assured.
Samantha.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that we live on a totally different landscape nowadays. I mean, in many ways, things are similar, but I think the main thing that young writers have had to deal with is the internet. And the internet is, in many ways, it's a brilliant thing. It's a fantastic tool for communication between author and reader. In other ways, it's not so good, and it's broken down a barrier that we now kind of need to think about whether or not we keep this barrier up. I mean, one of the main examples I've seen is that you've got a lot of bloggers now who do reviewing of books, and a lot of authors, I think, they find it quite hard not to respond to a review if they see a negative review of their book. I mean, I did it myself right at the very start when I went on Twitter and I found someone sort of saying something about my book that wasn't brilliant. And I kind of passive-aggressively said, "Oh, thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate it. I'll keep that in mind." And it was awful, because I just thought to myself, gosh, I would hate to be that reviewer when I thought about it.
Did you post that?
I
comment?
did,
You
I did.
yeah.
And I felt, and it was only afterwards, I said, "I'm so sorry, I just don't know, I don't know what came over me," because you just have to accept that not everyone's going to like your work, and that you're going to see that a lot more on the internet, especially with sites like Goodreads. And they're fantastic sites, and I really take my hat off to all the reviewers that take so much time to review books, and you just have to give them their space, and hopefully you in return won't be hit with a barrage of negative reviews, because often reviewers will be respectful and not show you something that's really very, very critical. But at the same time, I've really loved using Twitter and my blog, and I think it's fantastic for talking to readers and just hearing what they think, really.
In the future, I mean, publishers have always been very important for writers, for obvious reasons. And I wonder, partly also because writers never really had a strong relationship with their readers. There are some exceptions to that. Nonetheless, that's big, and that has changed. And I do wonder whether in the next few years the role of publishing will become less important for the reasons you've given, but also will be. It's not just will free up stuff, so to speak, but actually means the relationship between writers and their readers will become much closer, which has its perils, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it does have its perils, and I think it's quite easy to make mistakes, and I think after that one time that I kind of communicated like that with the reviewer, I never made that mistake again, and I always said, I'm going to be very respectful of their space, because if I was reading a book, it's like as if the author's just popping over your shoulder and sort of looking and saying, "Oh, what do you think?" It's quite uncomfortable, and I wouldn't like that if I was reading a book.
But do you read, Jim, do you read your reviews?
I do, and I try and be philosophical about it. The philosophy that I try and apply and don't always succeed is that you can't take offence that not everyone shares an opinion, and you remind yourself that you at the time you go to the cinema and you go with your wife and your best friend and your brother and your neighbour and another friend, say, and you come out and you've all got different opinions. One of you loved the movie and the other person is completely different to it, and another person thought it was okay but could have been improved. You get the picture. And no one's taking an offence. Everyone accepts that the variety of opinion is a kind of a richness. But I'd be lying if I pretended that I could apply that very easily to myself when someone's being offensive about your book. And I think on 3 occasions I've responded to reviews. Only on occasions when the person has been personally abusive. And the reason I respond to that is I think that at no cost to themselves and at no risks to themselves, they have made a personal abusive comment in a newspaper to which they believe there is no comeback. And on occasions like that, I'm being very English here, I just think it's bad manners.
Can you remember those 3? You can remember them now.
Yeah, on 2 occasions, I went red-faced and made a fool of myself to a critic at a literary festival in Canada, who'd reviewed 5 of my books very unpleasantly. You know who we're talking about. And there were twice I wrote to critics who'd been personally offensive. I always check with my wife, though, whether the offence is real or whether I've imagined it. And
you're a famous liar, so we'll take it with a pinch of salt. But do you read your reviews?
I read quite a few of my first reviews, and then I remember I read just one, and it kicked me in the gut so badly, and I just sat there and I just felt awful afterwards. It was a very kind of offhand. It wasn't a particularly awful comment, but it was just something that made me feel just awful about my writing, and so afterwards I was a bit more selective about what I read. And I think you have to be careful, because I think when you write a book, you are inherently putting yourself on show, and it can feel, at least it does to me a little bit, that when someone is saying something negative about a book, they're kind of saying something negative about you, and often they're not saying that, it's just that you feel like that. So I think you have to be careful about what you read, just in case you read something that kind of...
Would you do reviews yourself?
Would I review
books?
Would you
review books?
I don't know. I mean, I'm never... I always feel as if it's... I'm not sure I feel comfortable reviewing books as a writer, just in case you bump into that writer later, especially if it's a negative one. I mean, I wouldn't mind reviewing it if it was a positive review, but I would feel kind of yeah, and perhaps I shouldn't feel like that. It's again, it's the manners thing. It's kind of the sense of writer etiquette, I suppose. But it's no, that could just be my personal feeling.
No, I have refused to never review other writers' works because I'm not prepared to take the risk of not liking them. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you write a novel at any time, you know how hard it is to write a bad novel, let alone a good novel. I mean, a bad novel is still 80,000 words long. It has still taken a lot of commitment and a lot of effort. And for you to turn on a colleague, because that's what that person is, and criticise a colleague's effort seems to me to be gross, really. Mm-hmm. And it only happens in the writing profession. You don't find musicians reviewing other musicians. You get music critics, specialist music critics who review music. You get specialist art critics, not artists, who review gallery shows. It's only in the world of the novel that you get fellow novelists reviewing you. I think it's a big mistake. I think it's a mistake and cruel for the writers to have their colleagues turn on them, but I think it's bad for those colleagues themselves to be negative about, in this scary profession.
I think should we open it up for questions? Yeah. You okay there? Right, questions. Well,
I remember watching this televised interview with Graham Greene, and there's a striking moment when he says, there's a splinter of ice in the heart of a writer. Do you recognize that in yourself? Would you use that ice or a ruthless approach with your best friend when you're writing a novel, or your wife, your partner? Is that a trait for any good writer? Does it demarcate the character of a good writer?
Well, a really good question, and it's hard to judge. I think there is a little dagger of cruelty and ice with every writer, but some writers have got bigger daggers than others. The truth of the matter is that I don't think any writer ever means any harm. I remember once talking about Salman Rushdie's situation when he was writing. Coming from a Muslim family himself, of course, he knew very well what the issues were. And people were questioning, well, why on earth did he proceed with this, knowing what he must have known about the apostasy and insulting the Prophet, for example, in his home country of Pakistan and India. He must have known that in the 1930s, people that had done similar things were hunted down many years later. Surely he realized what was going on. How could he finish the novel? And the answer is maybe the answer that you're hinting at, and that is that when you're writing a novel, you have no sense that there's going to be a reader. All you have a sense of is that it's hard enough to finish this sentence, which is on the screen, let alone the next paragraph, let alone get the whole book finished sometime in the future, and then find someone that's prepared to publish it, and then for it to be published, and then for there to be a reader. The idea that eventually this private discourse, which is between you and the page or you and the word processor, is ever going to reach a stranger seems incomprehensible. And I'm pretty sure that happens with a lot of us. We don't mean any offense, we don't want to upset any religion, we don't want to upset any brothers and sisters, spouses or neighbors. But when you're sitting there in the privacy of that lonely room, anything goes.
Yeah, actually, I agree with that in terms of the idea that anything goes. I mean, it's like when I was a student studying literature, you're kind of very aware that you're putting meaning onto something that wasn't necessarily there. I mean, there's all sorts of complex readings you can do of Dickens, for example, and it's very unlikely that Dickens himself was aware of half of the things you can do. I mean, in terms of the shard of ice in the heart, I guess for me that reminds me of when an author kills a character, for example, and a lot of people can respond very strongly to that. I mean, imagine if Harry Potter had, actually died. I think that would have caused a huge emotional response, and a lot of people may have lashed out at the author for that. And again, you're just writing what you think is right and what is coming out of you. And I think, you do have to remember that there's a reader on the other end, and often you just kind of don't. And I think to some extent, though, you just have to be true to what you feel, even if that does make you come across as a cold-hearted murderer in some situations, just because there are so many readers and you can't possibly please all of them. So.
My question is that you've spoken about your writing life, and for a budding writer, apart from knowing the language and the being lucky. What are the essential qualities required for a successful writer?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to give a weird answer. I actually gave this answer to someone yesterday who asked that same question in the signing queue. I think good writers are not frightened of writing badly. You know, one of the greatest enemies of getting a novel finished is the tyranny of the blank page. You want your book to be perfect. So you sit down in front of this front page and you don't make a mark on that page until you've come up with that opening sentence, which is perfect in every respect. Well, I promise you, you're going to be sitting there all your life, because life isn't like that. You're never going to finish a novel, that's for sure. What I learned very quickly when I was a journalist, and it's a trick which I moved over to writing fiction, is that if you are prepared to write a bad first version, just splurge it down as if you're splashing paint on the page. It doesn't matter if it's badly expressed. It doesn't matter if you repeat yourself. It doesn't matter if you've got a muddle of tenses and your person changes from I to he halfway through the script. Because at least next day, you have something to respond to. So have the courage to write badly is my best advice. Someone said, a French person, that the writing is in the rewriting. Because next day, when you've got that bad version, then it becomes joyful. Because when you are rewriting, everything you do is an improvement. Everything is getting better. So you might feel miserable at the end of day one when all you've done is splurge. But on day two, you start to feel a bit more satisfied. Day three, it's that much better. Day four, you are so smug you think you're the smartest guy in the universe. Day five, you get a rejection letter.
I actually agree about the editing process. I find it almost more fun than the writing process, because you're just making those little fine tunes and adding all the details. No, yeah, it's enormously fun. I would also say it's to do with courage. For me, it's to do with having the courage possibly to write outside the box. And I spoke a little bit about this in my panel yesterday. But I'm kind of a very anti-genre kind of writer. I don't like genre, and I think that it's a reductive way of writing. For me, the qualities of a really good writer would be someone who's just willing to tell the story they want to tell, and not worry about what's going to happen at the end. You know, what genre am I going to tell the agent that this story is? Just someone who can just stick to their guns and say, no, I'm going to write this story, and like as Jim says, you can edit it, but I just think it's to do with thinking outside the box and just telling the story that is fighting to come out of you.
How the Western world sees the Indian writing in English?
Well, actually, one of the first writers that I read, I think when I was a teenager, that my father had heard about was Narayan. I mentioned this earlier in the week, who is a native of this city, of course. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is, if you are in England, your sense of India is much more likely, through literature, is much more likely to have been achieved through, until very recently, through reading post-colonial literature or even colonial literature. I mean, most of us read Paul Scott and E.M. Forster. And even though I think that technically we can admire the writing styles and also the plot lines in those books, I think you'd be a fool if you weren't aware that it's a very partial view of India. And it seems to me that the Indian characters in both of those novels, The Raj Quartet and Passage to India, were bit players in the land that they own rather than central characters. So I suppose what I'm doing is admitting to a sad ignorance of Indian literature. We should be reading much more. Recently, of course, there have been some great writers from the Indian subcontinent that have won prizes, and I've read those. But what I'm aware of, as someone who comes from England, is that the English language is much more likely to be formed by places such as India in the future than it is England, just because of the sheer numbers that are involved. There are, 50 million people in England speaking English as a first tongue, but many more, I think, as a major language anyway, many more in India. So it's going to be very interesting in the next 20 or 30 years to see the balance of power move away from England, more towards America, more towards India and other places. So with any luck, Indian literature in the future will be more in the ascendancy than it is at the moment.
I'm a bit confused. I'm a computer scientist and we constantly do peer reviewing of journal papers and so on. So are you making the distinction between public reviews versus private reviews, or you are not? I mean, peer reviewing for journals and conferences is part of the business in research. So we don't feel shy about, criticizing other people's work and so on. So maybe you are referring to publicly disclosing that you reviewed her paper, a book, as something that you find hard to do. But for awards and such, I'm assuming writers are evaluating other writers' works. Isn't that the case?
Do you want to go first?
Do you mean, are we sort of privately evaluating them?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I think we were both more referring to reviewing them in a public sense. But I suppose you're always thinking about how other writers are constructing their work and their craft. But yeah, I guess.
But it's a good question, isn't it? Because what is the background of that is that everybody in life has criticism of what they do. If you're a teacher, there'll be a staff meeting every now and again, and you're going to get feedback. If you're a scientist, you can't expect to publish in Nature magazine until your peers have had a look at it. Doesn't matter if you're a doctor, you're going to be assessed to make sure that you're a good doctor every month. And of course, that's how it should be. So why is it that we are so tender, us writers?
That's the question.
That we can't take criticism. Well, of course, I suppose we have to admit that probably the writing profession is more egotistical than some of those other professions that you've mentioned. But it's egotistical, I think, for a good reason. And that is that, and I don't want to make too strong a distinction here because I'm just winging it at the moment, but I think the truth of the matter is that when you're a writer, part of the thing that you're doing is expressing your own personality. Mm. And so any criticism that you get doesn't feel as if it's the book that's being criticized. It does feel very, very personal. Mm. But I accept what you're saying. We should become more like rhinoceroses and less like maggots. So less easy to squash.
Although, I think another reason possibly that there isn't this kind of sense of the gatekeeper in a way is because literature is enormously subjective. And I always say it's the best thing and worst thing about literature, whereas I suppose with a more technical profession, you would be able to distinguish if someone is doing something right or wrong, not necessarily always. But when you're writing, there's the basic rules like grammar. So if I hand in something that's completely, misspelled, then that's obviously a kind of a cross in the box. But
well, Tolstoy said, the absolute meaning of life is meaningless. So actually, I try to write. Actually, I pretend to write. So when I start writing, I feel, why am I writing? What it will give to reader? Thousands of books are written, lakhs of books are written, but what it is giving to people? Isn't reading a book is waste of time sometimes, or is it? Does it add to something in our life? Is writing worth something or not?
Are you wasting your time? Sometimes you're wasting your time. Of course, books aren't everything. We're all gathered here together at the Literature Festival, and obviously for everyone in this room, books and writing are important, but they're not everything. You can't dismiss somebody else who doesn't read, isn't interested in books. It doesn't mean that they're not necessarily a person of great breadth and width and value. The important thing, I think, in our lives, and I'm going to strike a very pious note now, is that we all have some kind of transcendence in our lives. And literature is good at providing transcendence. It's the specialist art form in providing transcendence. But actually, transcendence in life can come from lots of things. If you're a good fisherman or a good cook or you're a good carpenter, or, there are so many things. So I don't want to make a claim that the only way towards becoming a good person is by reading books. But yeah, some books are a real waste of time.
Okay, I think that might be a very good time. I have a sign saying it's a wrap, so I'm going to do a wrap. Not the kind of wrap that I might give, I hasten to admit. I want to thank Jim and Samantha, who I think were terrific, but I want to say something else. If you just bear with me for a minute. This is the last session of what I think has been a phenomenal festival. And I want to speak, just say thank you on behalf of all the visitors who've been here. And I want to thank Dr. Nirmala Lashman. I want to thank Rachna Singh Davidar. I want to thank the Hindu team and the sponsors of Lit for Life. I want to thank Kritvi and Rupa. I think it's been an extraordinary experience, and we're very grateful to you all. Thank you.